Okay, everybody, if you could grab your coffees, top them up, and sit down. We'll get on with our scheduled event this morning. Welcome all to this month's Mitchell Institute Hour here at AFA's Doolittle Leadership Center. Great to see you all out. We're really pleased to have with us today Brigadier General Dave Abba, who currently serves as the Director of the F-35 Integration Office. In that role, I think most of you know, he advises the Air Force Secretary and the Chief on the status of the F-35 program and engages with the OSD, the Joint Program Office, other services, and partner nation representatives to advance F-35 program capabilities. General Abba is a graduate of the Air Force Academy, the Air Force Weapons School, and has had multiple leadership tours in the F-15 CD, the greatest variant of that aircraft, I might add, and the F-22, plus several other aircraft when he was the commander of the 53rd Wing, which serves as the focal point for operational test and evaluation of new systems for our combat air forces. I first had the pleasure of getting to know General Abba when he was in Checkmate and General Mosley's assistant exec back in 2007, 2008. He's a very good friend of the Mitchell Institute and a tremendous asset for our nation's defense. So with that, Deke, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, good morning. Thank you very much, General Deptula, for the both the invitation and the warm introduction. As you mentioned, we go back a long ways, and it's really fun taking a look across the crowd here and seeing a lot of friendly faces, seeing our LM teammates in the room, and a lot of our international friends and partners as well. As I get just a couple minutes this morning, thrilled to have the opportunity to update you on what's happening with the F-35A within the context of the United States Air Force. I will caveat before we get into the question and answer period here that, as General Deptula mentioned, I work for the Chief, so there's going to be, I'm happy to entertain any questions that you have. I may end up having to direct some over to either Lockheed or the program office, but just keep in mind who I work for as we're asking questions in there. My plan is to talk for roughly about 30 minutes this morning to give you an update about what's happening with F-35. I'll give you a snapshot of what's happening within the program from the United States Air Force perspective, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about recent and ongoing deployments to the Central Command area of responsibility, and then we'll talk about a little bit about the way ahead, both for the platform and for the Air Force, and what we need to do to realize the full potential of the weapon system. My intent there is to save about 30 minutes there for questions and answers. I'm really curious to hear what's on your mind with that, and I'm not going to be in a huge hurry to get through that part of the process because this event is all that's standing between me and phase 2 of a root canal this afternoon. So bring it with the questions, as they say. It's also an extra special event for me this morning. My eldest daughter surprised us with a trip home from college for spring break, so she's in the back taking notes for Mom, and I will also deflect any difficult questions to Naya. So thanks for coming, honey. Appreciate it. All right, so to get started here, I'm going to give you a snapshot of the F-35A program from the United States Air Force perspective, kind of by the numbers. So far, as of roughly the 1st of March, the Air Force has accepted delivery of 227 airplanes. We've delivered those jets to 6 locations, and as a significant program milestone, just last week delivered the F-35 program delivered the 500th aircraft to the Vermont Air National Guard. So it's a pretty remarkable production run already, and lots of discussions. We can talk concurrency and question and answer if you'd like, but delivering the 500th airplane and not yet complete with initial operational test and evaluation, that presents a unique set of challenges as we onboard this aircraft, this amazing warfighting machine into our fleet. So getting a little bit into where these 6 these 6 locations are and how we're executing F-35 within the Air Force. Our test fleet is architected currently between Edwards and Nellis. So we've got primarily our developmental test fleet sitting at Edwards. We've consolidated the aircraft from our operational test fleet into Nellis, while those aircraft those pilots are still working to complete the final stages of the initial operational test and evaluation. Still have 4 live fly events to do Magoo out on the Point Magoo Sea Range. And then, as many of you are tracking, the long pole for getting completion of IOT&E is finishing the joint simulation environment work that we have to do. And that's a critically important step in this because, frankly, we have a difficult time replicating in the live fly environment the type of threat that we need to in the quantities that we need to in order to adequately test the aircraft. Plus, there's, frankly, just some things that we don't necessarily want to show in that live fly environment. From a training perspective, our training enterprise is centered primarily around Luke Air Force Base and Eglin Air Force Base, and both of those are growth industries, particularly not just across the United States Air Force component of that, but also from our partners and allies and our FMS customers who are onboarding the aircraft as well. From the operational perspective, we've got 2 locations that are up and running right now. First is Hill Air Force Base in Utah, and the second being the Vermont Air National Guard, who's continuing to accept aircraft. Hill recently declared full warfighting capability, which means they have their full complement of jets, which is 78 airplanes, fully trained pilots and maintainers, and they've got all the support equipment that they need in order to be able to execute their wartime mission. As I'll talk to you about in just a few minutes here from their combat employment perspective, we've already completed the first combat deployment with the Hill squadrons. The second one is ongoing right now, and it's not the last one. From a program of record perspective, the Air Force is anticipating a total purchase of 1,763 aircraft. And when we think about as these deliveries are occurring, we're currently accepting Lot 12 airplanes that are rolling off the line right now. We'll talk a little bit more about affordability from an operational perspective here in just a little bit. But from a purchase perspective, in the recently negotiated purchase for 478 aircraft across lots 12 through 14, in Lot 13, 1 year ahead of schedule, the cost of an Air Force A model is going to be $79.2 million. So we have broached the $80 million threshold a full year early, which is a tremendous testament to the production costs that we've been able to drive out of the aircraft. Additionally, especially as the airplane continues to mature, the weapon system continues to mature, the fully mission capable rates for the aircraft are continuing to accelerate over time. And frankly, in a 5th generation fight, in the type of near-peer fight that we're anticipating, and the reason we bought this airplane for, fully mission capable is where we've got to be. We've got to have all the portions of the weapon system working together to do everything and enable all the amazing capabilities that the aircraft has. That's a challenge in a 5th generation airplane, and I can tell you, coming from an F-22 background, there's a lot of similarities in how this works. There's a lot of times we'll get a track on our display, and you won't know where that track comes from, right? And sometimes there's various contributors to these tracks. It's a very different perspective than what I grew up in a 4th generation federated type of a weapon system. So sometimes it's not intuitively obvious to the pilot that you may have something going on with one of your systems. That's why we're relying upon the diagnostic and the prognostic health management systems in the airplane to help us understand what's going on. Another thing by the numbers that gets a little bit lost in the shuffle sometimes, we talk about the Joint Program Office rolled out a couple of years ago. It's Continuous Capability Development and Delivery Model, C2D2, in order to deliver capability to the warfighter. We have delivered, the JPO has delivered 4 software releases underneath that mindset, and currently we have the tape that all the operational units are flying is 30P03. And one of the amazing things that we did with that tape load in particular was we brought Auto GCAS forward. So we are fielding Block 4 capabilities. Auto GCAS was a Block 4 candidate that we fielded many, many years early. And that's a tremendous capability. Having flown Auto GCAS in the Raptor, it is going to save lives. We had one that was on the verge of being declared an Auto GCAS save. It didn't quite meet all the threshold criteria for that, but I guarantee you the pilot that had that event was glad that he had Auto GCAS in the airplane to give the warning that he needed to recover that jet. So that's a little bit of the bottom line on the numbers. And I'm going to transition a little bit to talking about kind of where we stand, with respect to perspectives here. And I'll give you our bottom line up front. This airplane is going to be the cornerstone of the United States Air Force fighter fleet for decades to come. We have to get this right. We've got to get the platform right. We've got to get it right for our airmen who operate and maintain the system, and we've got to get it for our allies and partners who are invested with us in this process. And the good news that I'm happy to report here is that, frankly, we're thrilled with the operational performance of the aircraft. The aircraft is doing amazing things in the operational environment. And it's kind of like when you go see an F-35 or an F-22 at an aerial demonstration, watching what the airplane can do in a physical sense, like we all kind of grew up with, is one thing, but you really don't get a chance to see all the magic that's happening. And what's happening in a fusion-driven platform, the ability to integrate sensors and distribute information around the battle space is phenomenal, and it's frankly a game changer in the Middle East environment. And there, it's just unfortunately not quite as visible as some of the other capabilities of the aircraft. My chief of staff last week, General Goldfein, in defending the budget on the Hill, said that, frankly, the sustainment cost of the aircraft is unaffordable. And this is probably the challenge of our time with respect to this platform, is to make the F-35 affordability and sustainment capability just as eye-watering as the operational performance is. But again, there's been some tremendous movement over the last 6 months and a tremendous amount of initiative with our industry partners and with the program office to begin to really move the needle. And everybody recognizes that we absolutely have to get this right. So we are making a lot of progress on that. Happy to entertain questions. I'll get to a little bit of that, more of that here in the last little bit. But we do have a lot of work left to do. So what's happened? I talked about moving the needle a little bit. How did we get to the point where we are right now? So once a year, Ms. Lord, from her Defense Acquisition Executive seat, hosts a CEO roundtable. And in that CEO roundtable, we had the 5 major CEOs represented across the F-35 enterprise. And General Goldfein was quite vocal in that discussion, as he often is, as the program's largest customer, and as someone who often speaks for his joint and coalition teammates in here. General Goldfein was quite emphatic that we have some work to do to make the platform and the airplane perform the way that we need it to do in there. And so he presented some challenges, frankly, some chief of staff imperatives that the Joint Program Office quickly picked up. As General Fick took the reins of the program office, he initiated what he called his first 180-day sprint. And this was to make tangible gains and make meaningful progress in some of the areas that we all know that we need to make progress in. And so effectively what we're doing is taking a weapon system with multiple decades-old sets of requirements and specifications and trying to modernize that into an era for great power competition. That's not easy. Right? We're trying to take a weapon system that wasn't designed with software agility in mind and trying to adapt to an agile framework on the fly while we're still releasing capability updates across the fleet. So to summarize kind of where this was going and the chief's emphasis areas and how the program office picked up on this, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what those specific areas of emphasis were and what we're seeing from a results perspective. The first challenge that the chief laid out was we need to build and execute an agile DevSecOps ecosystem. I just talked about the intro to this, not a small charge, but the progress that the team has made across industry and government over the last 6 months on this is really a compelling story. We look at the number of software factories effectively that are now connected via cloud sorts of initiatives across multiple levels of security is all essential because, as the chief says, I wholeheartedly agree that it's software and not hardware that makes the F-35 the quarterback, as he describes that role. And when we think about what the National Defense Strategy calls us to do to field capabilities at the speed of relevance, it is it's keeping that, staying ahead of our key competitors that defines the speed of relevance. And here's a quick watch check to make sure I don't run us all completely out of time. But another piece of that from an agile DevSecOps environment that's critical to understand is it's one thing to worry about getting agile done in an operational flight program or the OFP for the aircraft, but delivering weapon system capability across the F-35 is about a whole lot more than that. We've got to keep the joint tech data up to speed. We've got to make sure that the simulators and the mission data files and everything that goes along with with delivering that warfighting capability is on that same sort of agile process as well. Same thing holds true for Alice, and Alice has gotten a lot of attention in the media here recently. And there's really 2 major lines of effort with respect to Alice that are going to kind of intersect over time in here. And one is continuing with the Alice 3.5 line of effort, where we've now started delivering new Alice releases every roughly 120 days or so to get after some of the major pain points. And Alice 3.5 is going to be the core of Alice capability for our sustainers until we get Odin up and online. And some of the key components that we're working on with 3.5 is easing some of the pressure points of every time we move an aircraft from one squadron operating unit to another one. Alice wasn't necessarily designed with that in mind, and so that can be a painful process to move the aircraft, but we've seen a lot of tremendous progress in that. Lockheed recently started using Alice on the flight line. In what used to take upwards of a week to induct an aircraft, you may have seen some of the press write-ups about Hill flying an airplane 5 hours after they accepted it from the factory on a local training sortie. That's a remarkable amount of improvement on that. Key to this Odin transition that's coming up is really capturing the warfighting requirements. And so this is one of the major points as we've rolled up essentially four what were disparate Alice improvement lines of effort into one to generate to Odin. And it's going to be focused essentially from a United States Air Force perspective. What we're focused on is capturing the needs of our maintainers and sustainers out in the field so that we're continuing to alleviate those pain points and deliver them the capability that they need. Simulators is another area that's really, really challenging the way that we architected this system, multiple decades ago. What used to be a serial process, our industry partners have done phenomenal work in allowing a lot of those processes to run in parallel. And so simulators that at one point were lagging the operational flight program by many months have now been condensed down in just a matter of weeks, and those timelines continue to shrink. And the chief has laid out the challenge that we'd really like to see in an ideal world, the simulator software release before the jet software releases. That's going to be a really significant challenge with 6-month software releases. Lots of additional progress in mission data file development. This is one of those issues that's near and dear to my heart, having been a former 53rd Wing commander. For those of us that grew up flying airplanes that had essentially Excel lookup files to do comparisons of radar parametrics coming into our radar warning receivers, that's not what we're talking about with mission data files in F-35. We're talking in a 3F F-35 of well over 100,000 independent data fields that drive everything, not just from radar warning lookups of radar parametrics, but that's also the mechanism that we use to program all the scan schedules in the aircraft. So it's really core and organic to ultimate weapon system performance in there. Another big major area of emphasis that the chief threw down with in that CEO roundtable is to drive sustainment costs down to the high end 4th gen. This is really challenging in any discussion, as any of you that are tracking these conversations closely knows. Cost per flying hour is not the easiest thing in the world to talk about when you're talking about apples to oranges comparisons. F-16 is one of the obvious comparisons for F-35, but when we calculate cost per flying hour in F-16, it doesn't include any of the either electronic attack pods or targeting pods that are on the airplane. Those costs are not included. But when you have a fully fused system where everything is integrated within the outer mold line of the aircraft, all of those prices we have to bear within F-35. In terms of making progress on this, the most meaningful initial impact that we've had on this was, and the Air Force played a major role in helping the negotiation on this of reducing the cost perspective within the annual sustainment contract for the air vehicle. The Air Force has continued to be engaged in the ongoing negotiations for the next iteration of that, and we remain committed to a 25 by 25 outcome for that. We also need the ability to deploy and generate and sustain the aircraft at combat surge rates. So the ultimate, what those numbers look like are going to be reside within the classified domain. But I can tell you that we are not having any difficulties filling the air tasking order constraints that are happening within the AOR right now. The last major area that the chief threw down with an imperative on was we need to ensure that we have the confidence that the sustainment enterprise can scale with the almost exponential growth of the fleet. And the most significant needle mover on this is that we did a lot of work, again, across the government industry partnership to accelerate depot activations. And so some of those depot activations slid to the left by 6 years. And that's a tremendous, tremendous testament to the engagement and the commitment that everybody has to make this work. So I'll transition here for a couple minutes and talk about how the Hill Fighter Squadron did on their recent deployment. Their first deployment from April to October of 2019, 12 airplanes and roughly 300 personnel. Like I mentioned, the second one is ongoing, and we can expect that the combatant command demand for F-35s in theater is not going to diminish anytime soon. I have to tell you that I, as a former Raptor guy here, just absolutely amazed with what this squadron did. In the F-22, by comparison, not via choice of the F-22 community, but it took us 5 years from when we first introduced the aircraft into the theater in the Middle East until we flew that aircraft in combat. This F-35 squadron from Hill, their very first deployment to the Middle East, they were straight into combat ops, and the numbers are pretty remarkable. So roughly 1,300 combat sorties, roughly 7,300 combat hours, and roughly 150 weapons employed in combat. And really remarkable out of that for an aircraft that's at this, this stage of concurrency that I mentioned up front, is that we didn't have any bad bombs that were attributable either to aircrew error or to weapon system malfunction. That's a remarkable statistic for that first bit. Another piece that really stands out from the deployed statistics piece, and everybody that's in the room is deployed knows it's an opportunity to really focus on your primary job, and that's phenomenal. But what happened with the fully mission capable and mission capability rates while that squadron was deployed is really, really eye-watering. Started out in the low 70s of percentages and finished up that deployment in the 90s, in the low 90s. Now, there are some skeptics and naysayers who say, well, Hill just stacked the deck with all their maintainers. They brought all their most experienced folks. Hill is multiple hundreds of percentages overmanned in 3 levels, which is your most junior level capable maintainer. And the reason for that is that Hill has to be the seed corn for all the follow-on operational units that are out there. We've got to grow that F-35 experience. So no, Hill did not stack that deck from a personnel perspective. They brought a truly representative set of maintainers and finished that deployment over 90%. That's absolutely remarkable. Now, last piece of this that I want to talk about from their deployment is some of the big events. You may have seen the highly publicized strike. They participated in the strike on Kaunas Island, which was an ISIS stronghold, 40 tons of weapons employed between the F-35s and the F-15Es that were involved in that. This next story that I have is, I really wish I could tell you the classified details because it's really remarkable, but the ability of this aircraft to find targets of value, even when it's not what it was specifically tasked to go after, is absolutely remarkable. So you've got a scenario where a 2-ship is en route to an air tasking order tasking and gets an indication on their display of a high-value surface-to-air missile that had been unlocated for a while. SAM was really far away. And they were able to use the sensors on the airplane to quickly geolocate that thing and then take a radar map of it and then find targetable coordinates for that SAM. Now, we didn't end up employing ordnance against that, but it was a feed back into the C2 structures in the intelligence community that, an untasked F-35 essentially doing drive-by ISR able to find and locate something out there. Additionally, it's no surprise the aircraft were deployed during periods of heightened tension within the Middle East, and all I can tell you on that is that our aircrew and our jets were ready to respond on a moment's notice should the order have been given for anything, any additional missions to be executed. But I want to emphasize to you that we did not buy this aircraft for the Middle East fight. This fight is optimized, or this airplane is optimized, this weapon system is optimized to the near-peer competition that is articulated in the National Defense Strategy. Make no bones about it, this aircraft is the preeminent SEAD-DEED platform, suppression and destruction of enemy air defenses platform, and that's what we need to optimize it for. That doesn't mean that the F-35 is not going to be the quarterback, because you still need a quarterback in that fight when we're starting to talk about joint all-domain operations. And if you listen to what General Holmes talked about in his speech at down at AFA, he talked about the fact that we're in a long-range fires competition, and we have a challenge with generating mass of sensors and effects at range. That requires penetrating LO capability to mass sensors and effects at range to feed back into a joint all-domain command and control architecture that can connect the right sensors, any sensors with the right shooter, and any time to deliver the effects that we need. And in order to go down that route, the F-35 continues to participate in our Joint All-Domain and Air Battle Management System, our ABMS demos. The first one of those that was executed just a couple of months ago, and the F-35 will continue to execute and play in those going forward. So what do we have to do to deliver these outcomes? First of all, we've got to embrace the fact that the National Defense Strategy talks about the accurate diagnosis of long-term competition, and that's recognition that a competition is comprised of moves, counter moves, and counter moves. In the United States Air Force have had the luxury for the last number of decades of being the first mover in those competitive sequences of events. That is not guaranteed going forward. We've got to get comfortable with being the counter mover and executing things quickly. Part of that is we've got to get beyond what I consider to be a kind of a false choice in a debate that we need to mature, and that's the whether stealth is dead or not dead debate. We've got to get beyond this. The analogy that I use is it's not that when the second tank showed up on the battlefield in World War I that we all threw our hands in the air and said the gig is up. Right, so stealth has provided some unique tactical and strategic advantages for the United States for a long time. It is absolutely no surprise to anyone wearing the uniform or involved in this business that our competitors are very, very anxious to field capabilities that can counter stealth. We are aware of those developments and those efforts to counter stealth. And yes, we are working on counter moves to the counter moves to stealth. I'll leave that at that. We also need to embrace the desire to and the need to get Block 4 capabilities to the field faster under the C2D2 construct. I talked about the challenges of trying to adapt a 20-year-old and design weapon system to agility, but we got to get there. And we've got to get alignment beyond just the flying weapon system and all those things that we talked about. If you had a chance to listen to the Program Executive Officer, General Fick, talk last week at McAleese, he said something that is absolutely vital to reinforce in here. When we talk about the desire to get to defect-free code, that's something that's a desired outcome from an agile development process, right? We need a more mature modeling and simulation environment. We need the ability to do what we call fly, fix, fly in a synthetic environment so we have fewer escapes that get to test, and with a relatively small test fleet compared to the complexity of the weapon system, we're not going to catch everything in test. So the other key piece of that General Fick keyed on was the absolute essentialness of getting to modular code so that we can isolate various parts of the code to minimize the impact on regression stuff going forward. Another piece of that is we've got to kind of get over ourselves a little bit and acknowledge the fact that we never field perfect weapon systems. When we look at the number of open deficiencies that exist on this platform, I don't want to diminish the fact that it's critical that we get after open DRs, but every weapon system in the United States Air Force and frankly around the planet has open deficiencies. What matters is the severity of those deficiencies and ensuring that we have a robust process between government and industry to triage those and deal with them appropriately in our agile development cycles so that we do that. The other thing that we do that's essential with that is continue to monitor fielded weapon systems through programs like WESIP, like I was responsible for the Weapon System Evaluation Program in the 53rd Wing. Because frankly, every time we put new hardware and software together from platforms and weapons, we discover things. That's the nature of complexity. It's okay. That's what happens in a competitive environment. It doesn't mean that we're failing. The fact that we're identifying those things means that we're being productive, we're being proactive in discovering those things before we discover them in combat. We also need to, in order to advance this is going to be a collaborative effort, again, across that government and industry team. The JPO talks about the 5 ilities, and we're on board with these. These all make sense in the context of what the chief laid out as imperatives, and that's capability, availability, affordability, agility, and deployability. Part of this as well, I talked about our international partnerships up front. We've got to continue to find ways to maximize our interoperability. This jet is part of the glue that holds the freedom-loving world together, and we are going to go to war with each other. So we've got to get better at sharing data. And frankly, a lot of that in the service level is going really well. It really gets complicated when we talk about all the high-end feeds that come in to presenting data within this weapon system. So to wrap it up, right about on time there and open it up to your questions, I want to reinforce There's a lot we can talk about of prior decisions, right? We are all that are working through this program in the government and the industry side, the beneficiaries of decisions that were made long ago in much different strategic contexts. I'm not interested in relitigating those decisions. What I am interested in doing is what all of us can do in this room and beyond to ensure that from this point forward, we are making decisions that make the most sense for the program and for our respective services to deliver the combat capability that we need. Another thing that I'll foot stomp that General Fick said last week is that this is a real capability. 500 airplanes. We've accepted more than 40 more F-35s in the United States Air Force than we have F-22s. This capability, it's out there. It's going to be the cornerstone of our fleet for years to come, and we've got to make sure that we continue to optimize it for the National Defense Strategy fight. The ops capabilities are amazing, and they're getting better, and we want to have the ability to say with the same amount of confidence that the sustainment capability and affordability is there. And as the chief testified to last week, we are increasingly confident that we are on the right track to making that happen. And with all that being said, I'm happy to open it up to any questions that you may have.
Steve Trumbull with Aviation Week. Two questions real quick on what you mentioned about F-35 being seed indeed, the preeminent platform. I note that F-35 doesn't have HARM or an escort jammer system. So is something like that necessary, and how does it do that mission without either of those things? And then the second one is what General Holmes at Macaleese at that event last week and at Air Warfare Symposium talked about the idea of replacing F-16, pre-block F-16s in 5 or 6 years, and looking at loyal wingmen, low-cost attritable type aircraft to do that. And of course, the F-35A was supposed to replace, or is supposed to replace those aircraft. So does that put pressure on the program of record going forward if this other type of aircraft is the replacement?
All right, thanks, Steve. I appreciate you opening with 2 softballs. First of all, with respect to seed deed, part of what I think you're seeing as we mature into this joint all-domain operations and any sensor, any shooter thing is to an extent, we are going to be reliant upon families of capabilities in order to deliver effects. It's going to be really challenging to put all capabilities organically into one weapon system platform. That's frankly not the way that we've ever fought, and it's not the way that I would anticipate us fighting going forward. That said, we understand and have a high degree of understanding of what the capabilities required on the platform are. We are working to integrate weapons capability and pull that as far left as we possibly can, as well as doing what we can to ensure that we have the ability to get where we need to go when we need to get there from a self-escort kind of perspective to answer your EA question. With respect to comments, I think I got a similar question from someone else in the media right after that discussion happened, and I think I would focus less on the program of record element of that than I am the desire to keep options open for seeing what we continue to develop as we're moving forward. And I mean, the program of record in this aircraft is really long, and I understand that that's a natural question to ask, but I don't think anybody's ready to make that sort of a declaration at this point. What else? In the back.
Good morning, Brian Everstein with Air Force Magazine. You had mentioned earlier in the discussion on Odin, the key focus will be needs of the warfighter. Now that you've been at war with F-35s for a while, what lessons have you learned? What capabilities do you need to address with Odin?
From an Odin perspective, and I think the same thing holds true within 3.5 right now, from the desire from the maintainer on the flight line or the sustainer in the back shop who is receiving parts and moving them through the system is to have, it should be ultimately transparent what's happening, whether we're talking Alice 3.5 as it evolves or Odin. What we're focused on in there is the, minimizing touch points to do things like accelerate combat turn times so that we can get the aircraft back in the fight faster. So we don't want the IT system supporting the aircraft to be the long pole in the tent for combat sortie generation timelines. So that, I think, everything from statusing the aircraft to the steps that the weapons loaders have to take with respect to adhering to their tech order guidance of how they're loading the airplanes and that sort of thing. What else?
John Simmons with the Roosevelt Group. One of the rationale for introducing the F-15X was because of the sustainment costs of the F-35 to try and drive that down. Has the introduction and Congress's support for that program had any impact on the F-35 program?
So I get a little bit of a get out of jail free card on this one. I don't see the direct result of that. I can tell you there's a tremendous amount of pressure on the program to drive down the sustainment costs. The origin of that, I'm kind of agnostic to. I'm more focused on the outcome that we've got to get to that 25 by 25 kind of a number.
Hi, Pat Hose from Janes. So General Fick talked about how if the Pentagon was to enter any performance-based logistics contract with Lockheed, that the Pentagon would want additional data from the contractor. What specific data do you want from the contractor to consider entering this arrangement?
So I have another get out of jail free card on this one. So ultimately, the PBL decision is going to be held at the OSD level. Right. As General Fick talked to, there's been a steering committee that's been exploring this, across government and industry. Some of this is just we haven't been flying the airplane that long, right? And so it takes a long time to close out sustainment contracts, which means it takes a long time for us to get a high degree of insight into actual costs. That's an example of a bit of data that we're working at trying to kind of get some higher degree fidelity on before we would make a recommendation that we're ready for that right now. You guys are charged up for a Monday morning at 10 o'clock. All the easy ones.
Hi, David Isby, Air International. IOT&E, what time frame are you looking at for completion, and how are you cooperating with the other services to deal with the remaining issues as returned to a joint operational environment and a simulation?
Say no changes. We talked a little bit about timelines last week at McAleese, expecting late summer to be the closeout for the simulator trials. It's really, frankly, only about 3 weeks worth of simulator work. It's not a tremendous lift. Once we have the fidelity in the system that we need, and then after that, be a matter of how long it takes the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation to generate the Beyond LRIP report, so that we can get to the full rate production decision, et cetera. With respect to collaboration and coordination, nothing's changed within the Joint Operational Test Team other than the location of, we've moved the Air Force A models that were at Edwards over to Nellis for some synergies there. But in terms of knocking out the test plan that was out there, nothing has changed on that. Like I said, I think there's 4 trials remaining at Point Magoo on the Sea Range to take what we did at Nellis and frankly just expand it a little bit geographically and take a look at it in the maritime environment and then see how the jet performs in a higher end fight in the joint simulation environment than we're able to generate in the live fly arena right now. Tony.
Hi, Tony Capaccio with Bloomberg News. I want to try the Alice question again. In layman's language, what are the most serious deficiencies with Alice, even 3.5, that you hope the Odin system will ameliorate? And also, while on the Hill deployment overseas, has Alice had any crippling or debilitating effects on the operations?
Tony, I'll take your second question first. No is the answer to that. But we're careful to distinguish between the demand signal that's established via the air tasking order in Central Command right now versus what we expect to see in a higher end fight. right? So we're expecting that we're going to need to generate more sorties more rapidly, quicker turns for the airplanes, more sorties in a day for the aircraft than we're seeing in the Central Command area of responsibility right now. The requirement for Alice, to get to the first question on that in layman's terms, is the requirement was an IT system that supports the air vehicle. That's kind of what we had, right? In which it was not unreasonable if we think back to the time frame of when those requirements were generated. As we are developing and operating with the airplane at the same time, we have old hardware, we have old operating systems. When we designed Alice, the collective we designed Alice, what was in vogue at the time was the intermingling of the data with the architectural software backbone. That went out of vogue, but that's what we're still dealing with. And it was the recognition that we weren't going to ever be able to kind of unmingle that, if you will, and decouple it, that generated the recognition that in order to get to a modern software architecture, modernizing Alice wasn't going to get us there. It was going to be it required a step in a different direction so that we can leverage all the things that have happened in software development over the last couple decades. Does that help? Okay. Val.
Hey, Valerie Inslee with Defense News. So we've been hearing a lot over the past couple of years about agile software development and C2D2, but I feel like I've sort of missed where the goalposts actually are. Is the program at this point where it wants to be in terms of how quickly it's being able to get develop new software and update this aircraft? And can you talk a little bit about, on the operational side of things, like what needs to happen in order to enable faster development, testing, and adoption of the new software?
The short answer to the "Are we where we want to be?" is no. Again, this is I hate the analogy of we're building the airplane while we fly it, but I mean in this case we actually, no kidding, are. And so we're transitioning from a legacy waterfall every 3 to 5 year a major OFP release kind of a mentality into 6-month structures. That's really tremendously challenging. When we first started down this road, there was a lot of skepticism about our ability to do agile development with respect to the operational flight program. Turns out that's not actually the long pole in the tent. So Lockheed has been churning out software loads at a rapid clip, and frankly, from my operational test background, it's normal to have a rapidly iterative process. As we think this is going to be kind of the tape that we want to get to, and then nope, we found some issues with it, and there's a back and forth on that. So from a where we are right now perspective, I mean, we've got the ability, and we have been now 4 times kicking out software releases on a 6-month cycle. I think the major challenge right now is really getting the alignment of everything else with it, the simulators, the mission data files, right? This is not, I'll walk you down the road of the overused iPhone analogy. Right? Apple comes out with a new iOS, and then you're able to build apps that interface with that. The interface control document that comes out with that tells developers how to do that and what they need to interface with is designed around the most current software methodologies that are out there. It's all on the cutting edge. That's not. I mean, the code in this airplane is old. I mean, it's been around for a long time. So getting to modularizing that and reformatting that code is challenging. And as we are trying to do that, so I know I'm wandering around all over the place here. I'll try to kind of circle this back. It's a complex question. We're trying to get all the support pieces of that together while maintaining that 6-month cycle. It's frankly going to take a couple of years for this to all iron itself out. And it's probably about the time that we'll get the code as modular as we want it that will help us get there. You talked about what's needed on the operational side. I think that one of the forcing functions on this that we all kind of lose sight of at times is the customer and the consumer has to be able to absorb that capability when it's coming out. Right? If you're getting ready to deploy for a 6-month cycle, You probably don't want to load that OFP 3 days before you go. If it's a significant change in how the pilot interfaces with the vehicle and new switchology changes and that kind of stuff. So there's a training element of that, which means that anytime we release one of these tapes, it's going to take a little while for us to get it fielded across the fleet. You know, think about it from a B or a C model perspective at float. You know, that's going to be a significant challenge in order to make that work. Right now, because of the way that we design and release the software, we do a lot of discovery, learning, and test, because we haven't yet gotten to the point where the software is being developed truly within that agile DevSecOps ecosystem where you're testing all the new lines of code in an overnight kind of a thing. As that matures, then I'm fully confident with a more modular software architecture that we're going to have less defects that are going to be evident in the code. We'll have fewer escapes into test and fewer escapes from test out to the operational environment. It's going to be a transition period. We'll continue to learn. We'll continue to adapt. And so, frankly, all of this is changing faster than our collective system is able to cope with. But I am amazed. If you'd asked me 3 years ago if I thought we could do this when I was in my last job, I'd have said no way. Now that I'm looking at it, and I'm extremely proud of the efforts of the combined team to get there from here. And we've got, in a lot of cases, we've got government software people sitting side by side with industry software people making this work. Sir.
So you've talked about simulation, you've talked about agile software development, and you've also talked about the difficulty of having to operate, not showing off all your capabilities during those simulations. So how do you actually know those simulations will work? How do you know that'll work when you actually need those capabilities?
So I'll tell you that there's none of that that's new. We experience this with lots of different platforms. And the paradigm over the last several decades has really shifted, right? We used to do modeling and simulation to make sure that vehicles were safe from an aerodynamic perspective, and then we'd go out and make sure that begin to slowly expand the envelope. As our modeling and simulation capability has gotten more mature, we now use flight test more and more to validate the results of the modeling and simulation environment. There are some things that always are going to have to be done in a live fly environment. We're going to always have to make sure that weapons safely separate from aircraft and that they guide the way that we want them to. And we'll tell you that we have a lot of discovery when we look at those things because it's complicated. Down to the level of detail of some weapon systems round and some truncate. At the X number of decimal points, that induces its own little bits of creative friction in the system, if you will. All right.
Dave, thanks for being here. Thanks especially to our media for the great questions. It's interesting, as your AFA president, our media tends to talk about systems and the technologies, which is understandable given the advanced technologies in our Air Force. However, could you take just a minute and talk about the airmen in the F-35 enterprise, if you will, in our F-35s? I'd offer that our airmen, in fact, in the CENTCOM AOR may be the most lethal warriors forward deployed in F-35s. Some of those airmen may have worked for you. You can use their tactical call signs if you want, but if you could just talk about our airmen in the fight in the F-35 for a few minutes, I think it would be useful, helpful for the media. Thanks.
Yes, sir. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and I'll say I know this was not your intent, but I will say guilty as charged because when I spend as much time in and amongst our airmen, it gets easy to take their capability and their inspiring leadership for granted. What I would say about our airmen is that they have a relentless desire for perfection, and they expect it from everyone and everything. They expect a perfect weapon system, they expect perfect leadership, and they deserve both. Right, and so the art of leadership whether we're talking deployed or in garrison is reconciling those points of view. I don't ever worry when we have airmen who are coming up voice saying, we need to do this to make the weapon system better. I would be far more concerned if they'd stop complaining. That's when you really got to be concerned about what's going on. So what I think is really cool right now with where we are with this weapon system is our airmen feel like they really have an opportunity to make a difference because the system is absolutely listening to them. Alice, like we talked about, has been a challenge for a while. The number of folks that have gone to see our airmen out in the field and they experience what it's like for those airmen. For those airmen, especially when we look at what's happening like within the Bolt AMU out at Nellis, the Aircraft Maintenance Unit, those airmen out there are in direct interface with the coders who are working on Alice, and so they can complain about something on a Friday and then on Monday see the results of their labor as that software code continues to develop. They're watching their pain points diminish appreciably, and I think over the long run that's going to have a huge impact on our recruiting and our retention of making sure that we keep all these capable people that are out there. Focused a lot on the maintainer side because that's frankly the backbone of generating our combat capability. Our pilot force, I think, is absolutely in love with the airplane from what it delivers. It's not to say that there aren't challenges, but again, just like I talked about with the maintainers, if they're not coming up voice, I'd be worried. We're working on things, when we bought the airplane, if you look at the ORD, the sortie duration requirement isn't that long. We weren't talking about flying 7-hour sorties in CENTCOM, and that's what we're doing. That creates its own unique challenges with pilot flight equipment, with comfort in the seat and those kinds of things. And those are things that we're actively working through out there. But I would definitely agree with your assessment across not just our F-35 Bubbas, but everybody else that's deployed downrange. I think there's a high degree of confidence. And it's an interesting point, right, that I think reflects the ongoing state of tension. The chief talked about it in his testimony, and the tension between a combatant commander who has a 2-year problem to solve and a chief who's got a 10-year, I've got to have a capable force out in the future. I think the tension that our airmen in the field feel, and I know I felt it, when I was last out there, is that we have an extremely capable force today. We're ready to go, and we're ready to fight. That does not change the fact that we have to continue to recapitalize and modernize to ensure our ability to continue to be able to say the same thing in 10 years from now. Those are not orthogonal with each other. They're not in conflict with each other. Those two truths can be simultaneously true. Anyone else? Hi, Oriana.
What are your thoughts on just with updates and thinking to the future, as we heard from Steve's question on not just the F-16, but also how the F-35 is supposed to work with programs like Loyal Wingman? You have talked about how it's very software intensive for the F-35, and it wasn't that it wasn't foreseen, but that you have to work with it. Now you want to add a capability into the mix that you're talking to another aircraft, and these are aircraft that are basically subsidizing the F-35. Can you give us an update on, just your thoughts about how to integrate properly a Loyal Wingman program, and if this should be the, part of the Air Force's future or not?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you a reflective back to, I would go reference, where's Lucky? Where'd you go? Sitting there 3 rows back, the Mosaic discussion that was had at AFA in Orlando. If you'd asked me this question 5 years ago, we would have developed a pathway for that particular weapon system that you're talking about to communicate exactly with an F-35. We would have been hyper-specific in those requirements for the types of communication needs that existed between those discrete platforms. If somebody else wanted to bring a different platform in and do that, we would have developed a different set of discrete requirements for that connectivity to occur. I think the paradigm breaking that you're seeing right now is we've got to preserve flexibility to integrate whatever comes in the future coming forward. I can't specify that in 2020 for something that's going to emerge even as recently as like a 2021 kind of a time frame. I don't know what's going to happen in the meantime in there. So we're talking a lot more about flexible integration of those things as opposed to identifying a particular pathway, right? And this is frankly where some of the, the challenges of trying to do whether fifth to fifth or fifth to fourth gen gateways in the past have struggled, is because they want to take up either a particular formation position out of an exquisite fifth generation network in order to enable that, that's really been kind of the biggest challenge with that, as opposed to what we're doing with the ABMS thing, all right? And we're effectively laundering that same data without having to rely on specific exquisite pathways. And when you think about kind of the mosaic application of that and the desire to really integrate across multiple pathways, that creates a resiliency in the comm networks that really makes it challenging for our adversaries to target them. So that's a major driving factor of why that's developing that way. But it's a big piece in the push towards the open mission systems piece, the open systems architecture piece, so that we can really focus on the integration of those capabilities at the margins, as opposed to, I want a specific pathway for communication between you and me. Does that help a little bit? Okay. It's not a tweet-worthy soundbite, but hopefully it's understandable.
Now that more countries are getting their F-35s operational, how is your work in international dimension of that, operator to operator? What have you been doing, and how does that jibe with what the JPO is doing?
So I think I would characterize most of the Joint Program Office activity in the international space has been programmatically focused and on getting the development and production elements of the airplane. We are now operationalizing and normalizing this platform, and so we have a couple of other venues and forums. We have users groups in both the Pacific and in Europe, where we bring all the F-35 operators together and we share operational lessons learned. I will tell you, initially that was focused almost exclusively on the combat application of the airplane, but increasingly we're seeing more participation by the maintenance and sustainment elements of that as well, and that's being driven by, in no short part, by the leadership of our Air Force 4-stars in both those theaters, both General Brown and General Hurigian. General Hurigian in particular, since he was in my job a number of years ago, as absolutely adamant that we increase and enhance the interoperability of this platform going forward, in those forums provide a really useful venue to get operators together and share those lessons learned. Do we still have things to work through in those environments? Absolutely, but that provides a really useful venue for that sort of exchange at the operator level.
Hey, Valerie Incentive from Defense News again. So this is more of like a fun question on ABMS. So we've been hearing like tons about getting the F-35 to communicate with the F-22, which has been a longstanding problem. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts about things that the ABS experiments could experiment with that could prove game-changing for the F-35, or the way that the F-35 uses or pushes out data to other platforms.
Yes, and I have those discussions with Mr. Preston Dunlap on occasion. Like many other innovative types of things, a lot of the best innovation in this space is going bottom up from the warfighters and the users. I'm frankly not that current, as much as I'd like to believe that I'm current in my understanding of what's going on. So we're really reliant more on the folks that are trying to solve these challenges. This is really about solving warfighter challenges out there. And that's, again, I'll go right back to what I told Oriana. In the past, those experiments would have been focused on the particular exquisite pathways. We're trying to really open the aperture and find new and creative ways to share data. Again, I'll go right back to what Comac said. I think he's exactly dead on that. If we're going to connect every sensor with every shooter, we've got to get massive sensors and effects at range. Somebody's got to be on the leading edge of that to fill that data space, and that's right now. It's going to come from your penetrating LO capable fleets. Tony?
You mentioned that no airplane's perfect and they're all going to have deficiencies. The F-35 entered IOT&E with 13 Cat 1 deficiencies. What's your philosophy? Not philosophy. What's your view here? Shouldn't all those be resolved or have solid workarounds before this thing gets full rate production?
Fortunately, Tony, my view on this doesn't really matter. I don't have a vote in that process, but I can tell you that based on the pathways that we have to closure on the most critical of the open deficiencies that are there, I wouldn't have any objection to going forward. Is it important to hold folks' feet to the fire and make sure that we're delivering on the capabilities that we need? Yes, but it is difficult to capture. I'll say it this way: it is difficult to capture warfighting and warfighter relevance in words. That's the crux of the acquisition problem and the delivery problem that we have. But when we say I need this to work exactly like this, I'm drawing a line in the sand. If I'm a half a degree on one side of that line versus the other, is it really that different? Well, that's where all the art comes in this, and that's where I would tell you I'm quite comfortable with our processes for triaging and getting to solution on the challenges that still exist in the platform. Okay. Done. Time for the root canal.
Thanks, General Abba. I think all of you that heard him today would agree with me that the chief picked the right person for the job, and your candid responses and your expertise, I think, are illuminating to the audience. They were to me. Now, we have a bit of a thank you, and we hope that you can use this afternoon to defer some of the pain. But this is To Fly and Fight, Memoirs of a Triple Ace by Bud Anderson. And it's signed. He was one of our speakers at our Heritage Series, and we thank you for everything that you've done and everything that you're doing and what you'll continue to do. So thanks very much for being here today.
Thank you very much.
Have a great Aerospace Power Con day, everybody.